Okay, we're live on YouTube and live on Facebook and recording.
I can start?
Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Beverly Bain and welcome. I'll stop.
Beverly display.
Chandni, sorry, Beverly.
We're live on YouTube and live on Facebook and recording.
I can start?
Yeah, where did you disappear?
Good afternoon. I'm Beverly Bain and welcome.
We can't see you.
We can't see you, Beverly.
Just disconnected.
Chandni, sorry, Beverly.
We're live on YouTube and live on Facebook.
I can start?
Yeah, where did you disappear?
Good afternoon. I'm Beverly Bain and welcome.
We can't see you.
We can't see you, Beverly.
Just disconnected.
Sorry, Beverly.
We're live on YouTube and live on Facebook.
I can start?
Yeah, where did you disappear?
Should we log back in? I don't. What's happening?
Okay, Beverly, are you around?
No, she still hasn't come back.
Where is she? And, people on YouTube and Facebook actually might think that we ditched them.
I think she's on the phone right now with Ronaldo, so let's give her a second to try to reconnect. I think Ronaldo's talking to her on the phone right now. So for those watching us on Facebook and YouTube, please hang on a few minutes.
Okay. She's logging. Okay. All right, show us your face, woman.
Can you see me now?
Now, yes.
Rejan, did you stop it?
No, it's still on right now.
Okay. All right. Okay. I would like us to observe a minute of silence to honor the newly discovered 751 missing and murdered Indigenous children of the Maribel Indian Reservation residential school in Saskatchewan, Palestinian children and children around the world who are victims of ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity. So if we can take a minute to for a minute of silence. Thank you. Okay, thank you. I will now introduce our panelists. They will each present for 15 minutes, followed by discussion and Q&A, question and answer. Our speakers, and they will speak in this order as they are named here. Professor Nahla Abdo, Professor of Sociology and Anthropology. Professor Mark Ayash, Professor of Sociology, Mount Royal University. Professor Chandni Desai, Assistant Professor, Equity Studies, University of Toronto. Professor Rinaldo Walcott, Professor Women and Gender Studies Institute, University of Toronto. And Professor Himani Banerjee, who's Emeritus and Senior Scholar, Department of Sociology at York University. Welcome all. To everybody out there, we apologize for the interruption, but sometimes with technology, these things happen. We get cut off, but we're here. Thank you.
All right, I guess I am next. Well, I will do my part. First of all, land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that the land I'm sitting on is the unceded and stolen land from the Anishinaabe and Algonquin nations. Now is called Canada. Sorry, now is called Ottawa. And that thing of, now is called Ottawa, and, North America now is called, or used to be Turtle Island, and now is called North America, are two very important things that resonate with the Palestinian case of settler colonialism, as the settler colonial structure tries to erase what is before, erase the history and replace it with the settler colonial project. Okay, I'll begin by saying that Palestine, before that, I had a discussion with my friend Bev on, she asked me, do I want to keep Palestine as a global issue, or I want to change it to Palestinian struggle as a global issue? While I totally agreed with her on the Palestinian struggle being a global issue as an important title, I decided to keep Palestine. Why? Because Palestine, because Palestine is actually being erased intentionally by the West, following the erasure of Palestine by Israel. So Palestine is a global issue, as it is, in terms of location, in terms of geography, in terms of being in the midst of Arab oil. I wish we didn't have it. And in terms of religions also, with Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and, over 2 billion Muslims who continue to consider Jerusalem, if you want, as, their second major shrine after Mecca. Now, following the disappearance of Palestine by the Zionist project, or by Zionist settler colonialism, the West is trying to erase the whole term of, I want to make you read it better, actually. The West is trying to erase the whole term of Palestine. Whereas for people globally, in terms of disappearing Palestine by the West, actually, I'll give some examples shortly. Whereas for people globally, Palestine is a moral issue. For governments and states, Palestine seems to be a threat. Now, with this title, Censure Apartheid and Don't Censure Palestine, we know the examples of Valentina Azarova, I think all of us know that, and blocking her appointment, and the great stand that Kaut, unprecedentedly censure U of T, and there are a lot of supporters actually for Kaut's mission. Now, also the example of CBC punishing host Duncan McEwee. And Duncan McEwee, by the way, is an indigenous, Anishinaabe indigenous host of the current. For uttering the term Palestine, he was punished and forced to apologize the next day, and he did. And that was, to me, it was intimidating. The other thing, just a couple of days ago, Mark Garneau, our foreign minister, refused the Human Rights Watch report, denying that Israel is apartheid, and labeled the report anti-Semitic. Think about it. Okay, this is how Palestine began, with the Zionist settler colonial project destroying it, literally. So what we saw last month, exactly around the 15th, actually, until the 20th, and more than that, actually 10 days, 11 days, in terms of Israel bombarding Gaza, and violating human rights and, committing crimes against humanity, has been, done before, again and time and again. Now, we know that Israeli crimes against humanity were also reported by various rapporteurs, UN rapporteurs, from Richard Falk, 2008, who, by the way, was denied entry to Israel, to Richard Goldstone, 2014, who declared himself Zionist before going into the mission. He was forced by the Israelis to change his report. They did not accept his report because his report also accused Israel of crimes against humanity. The picture we see here, on the right, we see actual, real Gaza blowing up, being destroyed, under fire. On the left side, I took this picture from Haaretz. This is what Israeli Jews saw. And I say Israeli Jews because Israel, as you know, has about 1.6 million Palestinian citizens of the state. And these are Arab. And these people see what their people in Gaza see. They don't see what Israel shows them. And that reminds me, and probably reminds many of you, of the imperialist attack, or US actually, war against Iraq. And this is all what we saw. We didn't see human beings. We didn't see the million or more than a million people that were killed there. We saw how precise the military technology of the US is or was. Okay, I needed a window actually to go into the vanishing of Palestine. And the window, interestingly enough, came from a story told by Atalia Ben Abba, who is an Israeli Jewish woman who refused to go to the army. And one of her reasons is, when my father was my age, he saw entire villages of Palestinians loaded onto trucks and expelled. He told me that it broke his heart, but that he thought it was necessary. So just for your information, the leader or the commander of the army who loaded Palestinians on trucks and dropped them in other Arab countries was no one other than the actually Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who made peace with Arafat, as you probably recall. Okay, this is the Palestine that has been vanishing. This is Palestine in 1946, where it's all green. It is people living on and off the land, and living largely subsistence life, okay? And a few settlements that you see largely on the shores also, because this is how settler colonialism begins. But mind you, the ones on the right hand that go up to the edge, which is the borders with actually Lebanon, those were built earlier through the Rothschild empire. But the ones on the left, on the shores, is the beginning of settler colonialism. And that started again a little bit late 19th century, but mostly after 1917 and the Balfour Declaration, where another colonial country controlling Palestine named Britain, okay, promised the Zionist agency to give it part of Palestine as a Jewish state. They call it a Jewish home, which is the same as a Jewish state. So with that, they got this whole white part, but then it was not enough for them. They were well equipped, actually. So they continued expanding on the land of Palestine, grabbing more, stealing more, putting more under the control, until the Palestine, ended up being that small switched actually inside, inland. And this is something that, all scholars of settler colonialism talk about it in terms of how settler colonialism begins. Okay. And then at the end, this is where we are right now, and even less green spots that are there because of Israel's expansion again and again. Okay. So no, it is not at all a conflict. This is what we have here. We keep talking. Our media talks only about conflict, Israel-Palestine, conflict. It's not a conflict. It is not just occupation. It's not just the question of the West Bank and Gaza. It is a settler colonial apartheid state that includes the whole area of historic Palestine under Israel right now. So the so-called Israel-Palestine question should not be mistaken for a conflict. This is a case of the creation of Israel's settler colonial apartheid state after the annihilation / genocide of the Palestinians, where villages erased, where population uprooted, and many killed. It is a case of Zionist colonialism and Palestinian anti-colonial struggle from last month and even today, actually, because what is happening in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan and other parts of Jerusalem are still happening now. So from May 2021 back to 1920, over a century of united Palestinian front standing against Zionist colonialism and simultaneously gaining global solidarity. Struggle and solidarity, especially today, comes in an age where decolonization or anti-colonialism is turned into terrorism. Settler colonialism, the genocide continues. Israel's bombardment last month of the Gaza Strip is only part of a continuous process of genocide, which started before 1948. This process includes Israel's physical disappearing of the Palestinians and the annihilation of their economic, namely land, political, social, cultural identity, and language. The burying of Palestinian historical roots, executed by destroying over 500 villages and cities and changing the names of the whole toponymy. Settler colonialism and apartheid, embedded in the structure of settler colonialism, is racializing and racialization. So the settler state itself begins by separating itself and racializing itself as white, and racializing the rest, and especially indigenous people, as racialized, namely inferior. I hope Mark Gagnon is listening. He probably isn't. Apartheid throughout historic Palestine, not only 1967 occupation. And this is very important because when we hear of apartheid, we immediately link it with the apartheid wall. We link it with the West Bank and Gaza. But what I'm arguing here is apartheid engulfs the whole of the so-called Israel. It engulfs the whole area. Namely, there's apartheid within Israel, so-called proper, against its own Palestinian citizens, that Israel refers to them as Israeli Arabs and not even Palestinians. So apartheid is a concept that has been already reported by and documented by Human Rights Watch, by B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organization, Israeli as in Jewish Israeli, and also, of course, by the lived reality, which only the lived people, the people who live that reality, can tell you, and those who, of course, are in solidarity with them. Israel has over 70 racist, discriminatory laws against Palestinians, and again, keep in mind, its own citizens. These laws limit the rights of Palestinians in all areas of life, from citizenship rights to the right to political participation, land and housing rights, education rights, cultural and language rights, and actually religious rights and due process rights during detention, house demolitions, and name it. You find it all here. Each one of these, I know you're wondering, needs a special session. And one day we will have a special session for this. But if you have any question, please do not hesitate to ask. Okay, resistance and colonial, the visceral of coloniality, of colonialism, how it enters into inside you actually, and drives or urges your resistance. I'm quoting a woman here who spent several years in prison, and that woman was telling me why she joined the armed struggle, the Palestinian armed struggle. There are things, she says, that human beings cannot tolerate and should not tolerate. Resistance is about the person's love of her people and the urge to help them. When a person decides to resist, she does this because she refuses to see her people enduring all the suffering, the killing, the starvation, the pain and oppression they undergo living under Israel's settler colonialism. This is Ghada. Sumud is one form of resilience and resistance. And sorry, I do not understand it in English. Sumud is a verb or a standing situation which is known to the people who do it. Sumud means actually steadfastness. But the term steadfastness here is called for, is named after so many things. For Palestinians, it is one mode of resilience which leads to resistance. Global struggle and global solidarity. I'm going to actually stop soon. So let me just finish with this. The morality of the Palestinian cause, along with their struggle, are recognized all over the world. The morality of the Palestinian cause. 1960s on, we have been witnessing solidarity with Northern Ireland, South Africa, Black Panther, Algerian National Liberation, Cuba, Nicaragua, Vietnam, to more recently, the Black Lives Matter, Idle No More, LGBTQ2, and many more. In the 80s and 90s, we witnessed a strong solidarity from the anti-colonial Jewish women's groups, actually. I was part of that movement in Toronto. In 1990, a Palestinian contingent from Toronto joined indigenous people in Oka, forming a part of the indigenous resistance. In 2011, indigenous, Black and women of color feminists from the US went on a delegation to Palestine. They called themselves, the group called themselves actually the People's Forum, and 10 years after that visit, which was just this week actually, they put together another panel and discussed or reviewed that visit. After Ferguson in 2014, Black Lives Matter sent a delegation to Palestine. And later, a similar delegation of indigenous women from Canada went to Palestine. Okay, sorry, I missed one. Okay, a qualitative global shift. This is how I feel the situation is, and I'm finishing with this. A qualitative global shift in support of Palestine and the Palestinians. I have hope. I have hope when I see the growing power of the international solidarity movement embracing Palestine and the Palestinian struggle and rejecting all forms of colonialism, apartheid, racism, oppression, and hate. I have hope when I see progressive academics increasingly engaged in praxis and fight for justice and people's right to freedom and liberation. I am delighted to be part of this gathering. We need to keep talking Palestine and emphasize Palestine and indigenousness all over. We need to continuously drum the sound of justice, freedom, and liberation to all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, we can, thank you, Nahla. Okay. Great. So next, before I move to Mark, I just want to remind people who are following us that you can actually list your questions, because there is a question and answer part of this program after the speakers have spoken, and we will be taking questions. So please post your questions. Thank you. Mark? Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Beverly. And thank you, Beverly, and thank you, Minsuk, for inviting me, for organizing this panel, to Scholar Strike Canada for doing this important and timely discussion. I'm not actually in Calgary right now, so I'm speaking to you today from the unceded homelands of the Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia, what is today called Nova Scotia. My name is Mark Ayash. I am Palestinian Canadian. I was born and raised in Silwan, Jerusalem. Lived the first 14 years of my life under Israeli settler colonial domination before immigrating here. Silwan, as you may know, as you may hear in the news, is just like Sheikh Jarrah. It is under threat of ethnic cleansing, has been for as long as I can remember, and that continues until today, and will continue for years to come if action is not taken. So what I'll do today is I'm just going to briefly highlight 3 points. One is situate the story of Palestine and the Palestinian struggle where it's supposed to be situated, which is in the paradigm of colonial modernity. 2, I want to talk a little bit about the landscape in Canada in terms of a Canadian discourse on Palestine, a little bit about the media, and a little bit about academia. And 3rd, a little bit about transnational solidarity and solidarity across all of these struggles that continue until today. So I know some of the people in the audience listening today are not all that familiar with Palestine, may not have read too much about it, and probably think, okay, you know, this is not really something that I can speak about or know anything about. But I actually want to tell you that if you've engaged in any kind of critical understanding of colonial modernity, you have some entry point into Palestine. There isn't any issue that you've worked on in terms of critiquing colonial modernity that doesn't show up, manifest in one form or another in Palestine. Whether we're talking about race and racialization, whether we're talking about patriarchy, whether we're talking about capitalism, or we're talking about settler colonialism and Orientalism, all of these issues manifest in Palestine. So this is very much an issue that is, and a struggle that is rooted in the horrors that have been introduced to us and imposed on the world's majority population in this thing called colonial modernity. What obviously I can't talk about all of that, but what I'll focus on a little bit here today is on the issue of settler colonial sovereignty, because I'm writing a book on that right now. And even that, of course, I can't discuss everything, but what I really want to highlight within this notion of settler colonial sovereignty, a notion that appears on the world stage in and through colonial modernity, although I do think that some of its precedents do go back to the Crusades, the First Crusade and the rise of lordship in Europe. But one of those features of this settler colonial sovereignty is the notion that a sovereign authority has supreme and indivisible and absolute power and authority over a specified land people. It tends to claim for itself a kind of exclusivity that forcefully then tries to homogenize the heterogeneity that is the human condition. And this is very much at the core of the Zionist project in Palestine, at the settler colonial Zionist project of Palestine. It tries to claim exclusive Jewish sovereignty over the entire land of historic Palestine, as Nahla has talked about. It's not just trying to create that in Tel Aviv. It's not just trying to create that in what became Israel proper in 1948. It claims exclusive Jewish sovereignty over the entire land of historic Palestine. It is worth repeating. It might not legally claim it yet in certain parts of the West Bank, but it doesn't recognize any other sovereignty there, which means that it de facto then practices sovereignty there. It is the military, the Israeli military is the sovereign in the West Bank today. And that is a fundamental feature of all settler colonial sovereignties. Settler colonial sovereignty cannot tolerate the idea of indigenous sovereignty. That's not just in Israel, that's in Canada, that's in the US, it's in Australia, it's across all settler colonial sovereignties. Settler colonial states will never recognize indigenous sovereignty. They can't. It is their foundational structure that they only accept their own exclusive, absolute, supreme sovereignty over the nation, the nation state. They might tolerate self-administration, they might tolerate cultural autonomy, but indigenous sovereignty in the way that the indigenous people understand their sovereignty ought to be, that they will never recognize. That will never come about through reforms, that will never come through elections within any settler colonial state. That can only come through pressure and resistance from the indigenous people and all of their allies. Mm-hmm. And this is a lesson that history is full of cases where that is the case. So at the very least, that gives you an entry point into connecting some of the things that you might be already thinking about, critiquing the modern nation state, critiquing sovereignty, critiquing racialization and race thinking. That gives you an entry point into understanding some of the dynamics that are happening in Palestine. Now, when it comes to the state of affairs, I guess, that is Canadian public discourse on this issue, it is, to put it bluntly, shameful, shallow, and embarrassing. Whether we're talking about media or even, I'm sad to say, in the majority of academic departments, present company notwithstanding, there is a serious set of problems here. Let me try to summarize them this way. It is normal. It is considered the normal background situation that Gaza is under siege. Nobody really talks about that as the brutal structural violence that it is. It's just when it's reported on the CBC, clashes on the Gaza-Israel border. What border? What border are you talking about? This is a siege. It's not a border. People have been put into an open-air prison here. That's not a border. That's a siege. The siege of Gaza is so horrifically violent. I mean, I have trouble talking about it because it's just too much. But yet, in our public discourse, in the way that we talk about it, it just appears as, well, that's just the way Palestinians live. That's okay. That's normal. That's just who, that's their lives. That's their fate. That's their natural condition. It appears in those kinds of ways. Well, we have that on the one hand. On the other, what is toxic, what is considered abnormal to talk about, what is considered dangerous to talk about, is Palestinian liberation from those violences. So here we have a situation in Canada, this multicultural, liberal loving, blah, blah, blah. We have a situation where it is normal that Palestinians are suffering. It is abnormal, toxic, dangerous, don't touch it, don't go near it, to talk about Palestinian liberation. And I don't know about you, but that's not okay. That's not acceptable. And I think we all need to, the media, we can talk more about that in the Q&A because I have a lot to say about the CBC especially, which is, has the most, again, all those words apply especially to the CBC, the shameful, embarrassing, and violent coverage of this issue. I have lots to say about that, but I'll put that aside. Even in academic spaces, I can't tell you how many times I've heard of students, grad students, who come back and say, well, this prof told me, and usually I'm not talking about a conservative prof here, I'm talking about a liberal prof. And in some cases, even self-identified progressive profs that will tell them, career advice, that would be a good dissertation, but career advice, don't touch Palestine. Wow. Don't talk about Palestine. Mm-hmm. And look, that might be, there might be good practical reasons for giving that advice, but what I hope people start to do more is when you go back home that night, I hope you don't think, man, I gave some sage, wise advice tonight. I hope you instead think, is that contributing to the normalization of Palestinian suffering and the toxification of Palestinian liberation? How did I play a role in that tonight? What can I do more to make it okay for that grad student to write that dissertation and still get a job? It's not right that they shouldn't be able to get a job based on that. And so there is a pervasive culture of fear around this. I mean, and I've written about this openly, so whatever. It's obvious to me that there is a pervasive culture of fear in all industries, not just academia and media, in art, in government work. People are afraid to be associated with Palestinian liberation. And that needs to change. And nothing gives me as much hope as Nahla talked about excellently there at the end, than when I see scholars do speak up. And of course, it doesn't get lost on me that most of those scholars are racialized scholars, are largely women, by the way. I've noticed that a lot in my work. Indigenous scholars, members of the LGBTQ+ community, and of course, all the intersections across all of those identities, working class. Those people are never afraid, by the way, to speak up, mostly because they have nothing to lose either, or they're used to the sort of the structural violence of silencing and suppression based on their own struggles, because this isn't the only struggle where you get silenced and suppressed, of course. And that gives me hope, and that gives me inspiration, that gives me the motivation to keep going and to be a better ally to all those people when they need us. And I have some thoughts about that as well that maybe we can leave to the Q&A, and I'd like to hear what others have to say as well first. But that's a critical thing. Even simple things, when I read about the poorest of the poor Brazilian neighborhood that renamed itself Palestino, I think, or Palestina, because they've lost their lands too, and they have nowhere to turn, and no one's listening to them, and so they're like, well, this is Palestine. That actually gives me a lot of comfort, knowing that our struggle is still known by people who are facing similar things. So let me end it with this as well. That we need that transnational and intersectional solidarity to continue and to grow, and we need to start directing it towards action. And that's what I started with. That none of these situations will change without pressure on Israel. Israel will never change its behavior. It has no reason to. It can do anything it wants. It just did, and nothing, no consequences. Couple of harsh words, give me a break. That's nothing. Who cares? They can live with that. There needs to be material pressure put on Israel. And that's the only way to make it change its behavior. And for Palestinians to start seeing immediate action on these following things. There are many things, but let me highlight 3. End the siege of Gaza immediately. I mean, it is inhumane. It is unconscionable. It needs to end now. It needed to end 10 years ago, but it needs to end now. Take down that apartheid wall. Allow complete and unhindered freedom of movement for all Palestinians across all of historic Palestine. And start to recognize and build Palestinian indigenous sovereignty, and start talking about and imagining a layered and shared form of sovereignty that counters the settler colonial sovereignty that has created nothing but structural violences and horrors that are quite unimaginable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. Now we'll move to Professor Chandni Desai, please.
Yeah, thank you, Beverly and Minsuk, for this timely discussion. And I'm speaking to everybody from the dish with one spoon territory. I also want to begin my remarks today by first remembering and honoring all the martyrs that have been killed by the Israeli occupation forces in the last few weeks, all the wounded and injured, and also the thousands of Palestinians that have been arrested and detained and remain incarcerated, but remain steadfast in Israeli prisons. Amid the ongoing Palestinian Nakba, the catastrophe that Nahla began today's discussion with, showing you the maps and the destruction and genocide, we also see a stunning new era of mass resistance that has resurged in the besieged Gaza Strip, in the occupied West Bank, across the cities in historic Palestine in 1948, and the diaspora. Palestinians have asserted their unity in what they have called a unity intifada, as a people with an overarching quest for liberation, resisting the ongoing Zionist colonization of their lands, the ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem, specifically Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, and then in the West Bank with the Jordan Valley at the center, the 14-year siege on Gaza, construction and expansion of illegal settlements, the military occupation, apartheid wall, and the system of apartheid broadly. While this popular uprising, also called the Intifada, is not the first, what is unique about this particular moment is that the unity of Palestinians across fragmented geographies, particularly those that are rising up and organizing in mass across the cities of 48, from Haifa, Lid, Akka, Jaffa, Jerusalem, and the Naqab. Palestinian fragmentation has been a key strategy of the so-called Oslo Peace Accords, signed in 1994 between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and as Nahla mentioned, by Yitzhak Rabin, which has not brought any peace, but has consolidated Israel's settler colonial policies of depopulating Palestine and replacing it with Jewish settlers. And that's what settler colonialism is the replacement of the indigenous people. So under the cover of the Oslo Accords, Israel has engineered a very, very tight system of apartheid, as they've said, across all of Palestine. It has entrenched a system of control for the theft of land and natural resources, the control of borders, electricity, water, external trade, while the Zionist state unleashes brutal violence enacted by the army, police, and right-wing settlers. And again, this is across all historic Palestine. Coupled with restricted movements, curfew, closures, home demolitions, imprisonment, military invasions and raids, and the subjugation of Palestinian life to racist terror. These processes have forced Palestinians to recognize that a foreseeable future in terms of an independent sovereign state in this archipelago in the West Bank or wherever is not possible in the way that it currently stands. And so Palestinians have unified across these disparate geographies. And on May 18th, 2001, Palestinians observed a general strike as millions demanded their liberation, inspired by the 1936 Palestinian revolt against the British colonial mandate that took place when they were occupying or colonizing Palestine. The unity uprisings are also built on previous intifadas led by previous generations and have rejected all forms and layers of oppression. And in particular, they've also rejected the political framework of Oslo, which is nothing less than an obstacle to the path to self-determination. Some are also calling for an end to the paradigm and policies defined by the Palestinian Authority, and particularly its security coordination with the settler regime, as Israel has pushed it and strangled it in that direction. And yesterday, Nizar Bannat was executed or assassinated by the security forces. So this is a huge part of what is also being resisted. We're also witnessing the repetition of scenes from the first Intifada in various political mobilizations and resistance that we see against the Zionist regime. In the general strike, Palestinians have also reiterated their appeal for meaningful international solidarity, specifically in the form of boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, inspired by the South African struggle. We witnessed the remarkable solidarity of trade unions, specifically dock workers from Italy, South Africa, the US, and Canada, who heeded the call and refused handling cargo from the Israeli ship Zim, the largest and oldest cargo shipping company run by Israel. Following the blockade of the Zim ship or bow in Oakland in Canada at Prince Rupert Port, the Zim ship was unable to unload at the port on June 16th and was turned away. Such acts are significant as they rupture the flow of capital, both Israeli capital and global capital. Weeks ago, we saw demonstrations as thousands protested across the Middle East, South Asia, Africa, Latin America, and an unprecedented number of people took to the streets in the US, UK, and Canada. Here, large numbers of signed petitions and statements were released from various sectors. For example, the National Council of Canadian Muslims generated over 100,000 letters regarding Israel's attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the ethnic cleansing in East Jerusalem, and violence and the siege of Gaza. I Don't Know More issued a statement of solidarity with the uprisings, and prominent activists from various social movements, including Black Lives Matter, were very vocal here in Canada. In the US, the Movement for Black Lives also issued a statement that demanded that the US cut off its $3.6 billion of aid to Israel in the annual military funding that they provide, and also forced or suggested that the US impose sanctions. As we witness thousands rise up, folks have been trying to understand the shift in public opinion regarding Palestine. The shift is perhaps mainly in the Western world, because solidarity is not new, particularly for the tricontinental, especially Africa, Latin America, and Asia, which includes the Arab nations. They have always stood and understood Palestine as a global anti-colonial, anti-imperialist issue, an Arab issue, and a tricontinental issue. In the Western political imaginary, Palestine remained on the margins because of the imperialist intimacies between Western governments and their unrelenting support for Israel, though, of course, solidarity with Palestine among leftists and radicals were strongly expressed in the 1960s. During the height of the Third World's challenge to Western hegemony in the 60s, revolutionary nationalist armed struggles across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, including the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and radical organizations in the United States and Canada forged alliances in joint struggle against imperialism through a politics of internationalism. Palestinian revolutionaries drew their tactics and strategies from revolutionaries in Cuba, Algeria, South Africa, Vietnam, China, and elsewhere. And liberation struggles such as the Algerian FLN, the National Liberation Front, adopted one of the Palestinian factions, Fatah, as a protege of its struggle against settler colonialism, training cadres in their global offensive. Hysteric articulations of solidarity framed racism and colonialism as intertwined and co-constitutive structures of domination and sought to unravel them across the entire globe. The internationalism that bound the PLO to other movements constituted a praxis of solidarity that centered advancing struggles through revolutionary praxis. For the revolutionaries involved, solidarity was neither a commodity to be exchanged, collateral to be held, nor a debt requiring repayment, as Robin Kelly reminds us. And Rabab Abdulhadi argues for movements like the American Indian Movement, the Brown Beret, the Iwar Kun, the Red Guard, El Comite, the Young Lords, the Black Panther Party, and SNCC. Support for the Palestinian struggle was consistent and uncompromising. The basis of solidarity was also centered on class. As Russell Rickford, a historian of the Black radical tradition, suggests, Third Worldism transcended kinship with the African diaspora. It centered a class analysis, defining its adversary as the entire apparatus of international domination. Third World internationalists, which included Black internationalists globally, openly criticized Israel and embraced the Palestinian struggle because of the status of Israel as an imperial power from 1948, but particularly after the 1947 war, as well as its alliance with US imperialism and Israel's role in supporting apartheid in South Africa and its extractive practices of mineral resources from the African continent. While I don't have time to discuss the long history of the infrastructure of solidarity these revolutionaries built, the collapse of internationalism with Palestine took place after the fall of the Soviet Union, neoliberalization of the global economy, demobilization of various liberation movements, and the signing of the Oslo Accords. Thus, solidarity became depoliticized and individualized, and so the new actors that came to the scenes were from NGOs and UN aid agencies. These conditions also shifted liberation politics across the world, including within Palestine, which is why today's Unity Intifada is so significant, because it centers a politics of liberation, not a politics of reform. Now, whether it'll sustain is a different question. Also, the BDS movement's call in 2005 for dismantling the Zionist system in its entirety, its settler colonial apartheid system, occupation, and upholding the rights of Palestinian refugees and the rights of the citizens of Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, drastically redefined solidarity as an ethical obligation to end Israel's complicity in Zionist colonialism and engage in a struggle within the long-term imperatives and objectives of Palestinian liberation. After the BDS call in North America, we began to see a shift in the politics of solidarity, which was amplified massively during the 2008-2000 bombing of Gaza. Again in 2014, when Gaza was bombed again. Well, it continues to bomb it, but in large sort of mass scale for weeks. And then most recently, when we saw this recent invasion. It has taken over a decade of organizing in various sectors, labor, academia, health, government, and social movements, to see the shift of consciousness, both of the left and in the mainstream. And these antecedents are important to understand the shifts that we're seeing in public opinion today. People just didn't all of a sudden change their mind overnight about Palestine. Movements have been organizing to shift consciousness strategically and have built campaigns. And also there's a long history of internationalism that precedes what we're seeing right now. And over the last several years, we saw a resurgence in internationalism, specifically from indigenous struggles from Standing Rock, Menakea, Wet'suwet'en, to the movement for Black Lives and their fierce organizing and the use of social media also as a platform for non-mainstream narratives to shift public opinion in North America on racism, heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, and other issues. The principal solidarity of these movements has uplifted the Palestinian struggle and its legitimacy in the West, as activists have made linkages between imperialist circuits of violence. For example, we see the way in which people have made connections between police trainings that Israel has engaged in terms of US police departments or Canadian police departments, or counterterrorism training, or whatever, things of this nature. And it's the conjoined efforts that these organizations or movements have taken to develop collective strategies of resisting state and corporate violence that provides us a lot of hope today. Activists are engaging in joint struggle campaigns and initiatives that target policing, the military-industrial complex, border-industrial complex, pipelines and their infrastructure, flows of global capital, racial capitalism, and of course, various local structures of power and domination. But though at times one of the challenges of solidarity in North America is also that the struggle sometimes can only be legible when it's in the form of identity politics, rather than also the political analytic targeting capitalist imperialism. So oftentimes it'll be about the racial imperative, but not about the other aspects of our politics. And so Palestine cannot be delinked from the global. It cannot be delinked from the tricontinental. It cannot be linked from the global economy. It cannot be linked from the Arab geography. And in fact, we need to strengthen how we link the anti-imperialist politics of this colonial state that was built on the conjoint violence of indigenous dispossession and genocide, slavery, anti-Black racism, racialized immigrant labor exploitation with Israel, because they're intimacies. Canadian imperialism is complicit in the dispossession and oppression of the Palestinians. Canada has been one of the strongest supporters of the Israeli settler regime, even preceding the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. Historically, the colonial state of Canada, influenced by Zionist players, Zionists, played a major role in the partition of Palestine in 1947, despite Palestinian refusal for the partition. So Canadians thought they could decide whose land should be divided and where that land should go. But, they did it because why would they think otherwise? They're doing it here. Canadian backing of Israel also includes arms sales, free trade agreements, security forces collaboration, diplomatic, economic, and security relations. Canadian military trainers have supported and provided aid and resources to the Palestinian Authority security forces, forcing natives to enforce their own occupation on themselves. Israeli forces have also trained Canadian police. Canada also allows illegal recruitment for the Israeli military in this country. Additionally, Palestinians and their political life in Canada has been criminalized as Palestinian organizations are placed on Canada's terrorist list, including charities. Yet the federal government provides tax deductions for charities that have raised over $250 million for Israel-focused projects which support the illegal settlement expansion, land theft enacted especially by the Jewish National Fund, explicit racist institutions, and the military. In their international arena, Canada has vetoed resolutions that pertain to Palestinian rights and freedoms, more than 50 times siding with Israeli war crimes. A few months ago, Prime Minister Trudeau's government withdrew Canada from a major UN forum on combating racism. 2 years ago, it adopted a definition of anti-Semitism created to shield Israel from criticism, to protect Israel's regime. And Trudeau and other leaders have repeatedly condemned anti-colonial activists on university campuses and their organizing. Academic institutions and media tend to reproduce the oppressive politics and policies and discourses of the Canadian state that Mark has mentioned, and therefore these institutions continue to support Israel and ignore the plight of the Palestinians. CBC doesn't even acknowledge the existence of Palestine as a place, which is totally absurd, and an enactment of anti-Palestinian racism, denying a people their history, narrative, and nation. In academia, the Zionist lobby is heavily involved at pressuring Canadian universities and their administrators to repress, censor, and silence teaching, research, and activism on the question of Palestine. And we've seen the terrible outcome at the U of T Law School. However, scholars and students need to take a principled stance of solidarity. Why? Because Israeli universities play a central role in planning, implementing, and justifying Israel's occupation and settler apartheid policies, and are an organic part of the military establishment. For example, Tel Aviv University has developed tens of weapon systems to deploy disproportionate force against Palestinians. Technion develops military drone technologies and remote-controlled weaponized bulldozers used to demolish Palestinian homes. Palestinian universities such as Desai, for example, are routinely raided by Israeli occupation forces, and students and faculty members are arrested and detained. Over the last 20 years, approximately 920 students have been arrested, and 28 students have been killed by soldiers. More recently, in May, my colleague and dear friend, Dr. Lina Mieri at Desai, was targeted with a sound bomb that hit her head, causing injury to the skull while she was at a demonstration in Sheikh Jarrah, protesting the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Jerusalem. This is the reason that academics and students have to stand up and have to defy the current status quo that is in place. With global powers joining forces to oppress resistance across the world, it is imperative to underscore the linkages between those fighting for mutual liberation. And a leftist analytic of joint struggle tells us about the possibilities of freedom and world making. And so, like Nahla and Mark, there is hope, and I am excited by that hope in this struggle. The call has come from Palestine. It came in 2005, but the call has come again in the most intense form. And now it's time for you to think about how you will heed that call from whichever sector you're in. Thank you.
Chandni, thank you so much for your contribution. And next we have Professor Ronaldo Walcott.
Thank you, Bev. Thank you, Minsuk. Thank you, College Right Canada, for having me participate in this really important conversation. Of course, when my former teacher, Nahla Abdo, sent me a note asking me to participate, I said yes right away. I spent 2 semesters as a 20-something-year-old reading Marx and Said with Nahla. And we didn't just stop there. Then we read South African and Palestinian scholars who were the interlocutors and critics. And so, much of what I might say here today still draws from that really important history. And at the time that I was reading Marx with Nahla, we were a group of us, literally a group of us, myself, Mary Jo Nadeau, Kasha Rusto, Rob Gill, Gamal Abdel Shahil, Davina Bandar, a whole group of us literally sat at the feet of Himani, reading Marx as well, and Fanon, and Sheila Rabotham, and Ajaz Ahmad, and arguing and debating feminism and race and capital. And of course, Himani always fed us her fantastic cooking as well. So it's a tremendous moment for me to be sitting here speaking with two of my former teachers, formal and informal, who I've learned so much from. But I do want to say that my comments here today are said in the memory of our friend Himani, my friend, the late Mary Jo Nadeau, who kept the question of Palestine alive in our friendship group. We should be ambivalent about the university. The university has to be, and is for many of us, a site of struggle. The university's embeddedness in and reproduction of what I'm going to call colonial liberalism, by which I mean the mirage of democratic process, claims of representation, claims of openness, academic freedom, and so on, is among its seductive qualities and its mode of regulation too. And when folks feel or experience betrayal of the university's colonial liberalism, too many throw it away as irrelevant and a site for struggle, and a site for struggle connected to all of our other struggles. The university and the knowledges it produces are intimately connected to all the struggles we are gathered here today to discuss. The university is foundational to the world we have now, and it is foundational to the world we will have tomorrow, the next day, and the next. But the university also has an ambivalent relationship to what we have with shorthand named activism. Many activists eschew the university as irrelevant in favor of another shorthand term, the community. I'm interested in the link between the two though. Many who call themselves activists have strong links to the university, and many others have those ties, and yet others have ongoing complex relationships with the university, or rather people inside the university. Indeed, many an activist comes into their activism or refine their language and politics of activism in classrooms. Many are exposed to new and different positions in the university. Many have their political ideas, positions, suspicions, and experiences confirmed in classrooms. I could go on, but what I'm getting at is that the university is never outside of activism, even though many like to behave like it is. We will need to banish that fiction because it only serves to allow the university to do its deadly business almost on watch. I've begun with this kind of reflection on the university because in the small and shrinking spaces in the university where radical politics, thought, and action are possible, the university is a vital source for animating the politics of the possible, for imagining new ways of living better together. I'm not offering this in opposition to other spaces, but as a supplement to them. Indeed, I would argue that colonial liberalism succeeds when we dismiss the potential of the university to be a part of the transformation that we're fighting for. No better example of what I'm suggesting exists than in the Valentina Azarova case at Censored U, better known as the University of Toronto. And I apologize if I repeat some of what my colleagues said before. The rescinding of the job offer to Azarova, a scholar who wrote on Palestine, highlights all the ways in which the university's colonial liberalism functions to keep the status quo in place, all the while claiming otherwise, and how the university exists well beyond its boundaries, impacting, reproducing, and reinforcing political practices and ideas that are the foundation of global coloniality. But it was also in the university that I learned to notice this discrepancy, and more importantly, to participate in acts with others to undo and transform those practices that add up and combine to keep us all in ongoing colonial hierarchical relations. The Azarova case is one example among many others that demonstrates why the university is a site of struggle among all of our struggles. Censored U has long been hostile to the Palestinian struggle. The years of attacks on students and others organizing Israeli apartheid week should not be forgotten. That Palestine and its common freedom is a lightning rod in the university should really surprise no one who pays attention to the university as an institution. The knowledges that flow from the university shape our everyday lives through policy making, through the commingling of university elites, government and industry elites, as they assume the broader mantle of structuring the society in their interests, that of white patriarchal capitalism, and authorizing its junior partners to carry out this ongoing global colonial project. The violence of colonial liberalism does not, of course, only reside in the university, But the university is one site where many of us learn to engage a politics of solidarity that has been essential to our movements and the kinds of collective responses, rethinking of strategy, and the wrestling with difficult histories of our encounters, betrayals, and how we continue to work together. In this regard, extending beyond the university as only one site among others producing knowledge useful for our struggles, colonial liberalism has sought to use our differences to hide the very function of the work colonial liberalism does. In the Canadian context, multiculturalism continues to hide the work of colonial liberalism and to absolve Canada of a colonial past of colonization and its ongoing for evidence of violence, second-tier imperialism, ecological disaster, and so on. I sat listening to CBC radio daily as the Israeli state dropped bombs on Palestine and its people, especially its children. As Canadian professors and other professionals from across the country came on to talk about the mental health issues facing Canadian children who could not have the experience of graduation rituals, get to say goodbye to classmates in person, complete sporting events they had previously trained for, and on because of the pandemic. I had to repeatedly ask myself, what do these conversations ask me to not see, hear, and acknowledge? Colonial liberalism would have us believe that the children in the West require school every day, graduation rituals, and play dates for proper socialization. But colonial liberalism will also have us look away from Canada's sale of armaments to Saudi Arabia, to bomb schools in Yemen. It will have us take as normal children rescued from their bomb homes in Palestine as just the way things are over there. Colonial liberalism will have us not question white supremacist global arrangements of violence as long as those arrangements remain enacted over there. But we know those arrangements are not just enacted over there, as Quebec, January 29, 2017, and London, Ontario, just this month, remind us daily, if we so care to remember and notice. And when those actions erupt here, as must occur, colonial liberalism will have us speak the language of exceptionality and multiculturalism to cover the barbarism of the eruption, to suggest that ours is an anomaly. What we have seen and continue to live in the post-World War II world is the unabashed violence of colonial liberalism, marked as the language of conflict, as spreading democracy, as multiculturalism, as inclusion. But it's actually what the late Neil Smith called overlapping colonialisms, the old colonialism of land theft, occupation, and extraction, with the new colonialism of financialization and monetary movement, alongside restricted borders, ever-increasing policing of all sorts, and practices of diversity, inclusion, and equity. Keeping in place are the old hierarchical colonial racial relations and the ongoing hoarding of resources of all kinds by the West. Most of this old and new colonialism is executed under the aegis of international law and buttressed by institutions like the United Nations and other extra-governmental organizations. Since 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights had inaugurated a double move of colonial liberalism. In one move, the declaration produces an endpoint of colonial violence, making it appear that the atrocities enacted on European Jews are the highest possible form of violence ever witnessed globally and should never happen again. And at the same time, the declaration in part produces cover for the establishment of the Israeli state and its justification for a settler colonial project produced through expulsion, violence, and a claim of innocence because of previous European violence. This double move clouds what human rights can mean, and it specifically excludes Palestinians, among others, from its purview. Enfolded in the double move, as Paul Gilroy and others have pointed out, is an ideological maneuver that displaces the history of the fight against slavery, the colonization of the Americas, and its violent settler colonies, and other resistances to other colonial settlements as outside human rights discourse, making 1948 a new beginning as opposed to the extension of previous and now still ongoing struggles for human rights as we began this conversation with a minute of silence for the 700 more dead in Canada. So we signed the letters to the UN, to the EU, even to the US, the Biden administration. I surely did in this most recent round of war. But we must understand the gesture of signing the letter as more symbolic than a gesture that seeks to right the wrong to riff off of Spivak, that is in progress and might harbor a different kind of future. In places like Canada, the multicultural myth marks human rights as the highest order of colonial liberalism. In this way, rights are imagined and given via the discourse of recognition. But we know in this Canadian settlement, the Palestinian as a rights-bearing and desiring subject is up for grabs at the students at Forest Hill Collegiate Institute, recently reporting the defense of Javier Davila at the TDSB. In the university, the same logic now goes under the name equity, diversity, and inclusion. And again, is another attempt to mask the ongoing operations of colonial practices, logics, and structures, which insist we should now believe these structures no longer do harm, because one representative body that is usually not white, but not always, now sits at the table. These kinds of colonial liberal ideological moves have produced a political culture that calls for, I think, a whole new set of tactics, new risks, new articulations of what solidarities might look like. It has never been surprising to me that South Africans were among the first, given the work that I did with Nahla all those years ago, were among the first, well ahead of Human Rights Watch, to declare Israel an apartheid state. My educations, I briefly stated at the beginning, made that make sense to me a long time ago. Let's be clear about something though. All settler states, even those with indirect rule, are apartheid states with genocidal practices. They partition people by race, culture, religion, and other arbitrary categories to maintain power, extract resources, and privilege those who are actively pillaging those resources. More frankly, to govern others as racial or religious or other kinds of subordinates in their native geographies is to create apartheid states. What I think is important to note is the ongoing BDS movement and its similarities and difference from the historic anti-apartheid boycott South Africa. Now is the time to ask whether BDS should be expanded. What would it mean to fully make the Israeli state the kind of pariah state that South Africa once was? These to me are urgent questions for those of us tasked with moving governmental and extra-governmental bodies to act differently, to produce a different future. Canada is skilled at producing colonial and colonial liberalism's technologies, from the reservation system that apartheid South Africa borrowed to multiculturalism as cover for ongoing coloniality. In Canada, those of us working towards something like justice are called to undo what is produced as Canada's global benevolence. The movement for Black Lives, and specifically the US-based BLM, have made all kinds of connections with the Palestinian freedom movement. And these connections and solidarities are to be more than commended because they continue a long tradition of Black people in the Americas demonstrating solidarity with Palestine. And Chandni went through some of that historical work in quite detail. On the other hand, there have been the rather curious political moves by some Black people who attempt to both educate about and affirm Afro-Palestinian lives, but offer these lives as a way of critiquing something called Palestinian anti-Blackness and to justify their own silence on Israel's wars. The skilled move is one that troubles me because it clearly has not fully thought through the implications of the category Palestinian while trying to bifurcate it and place a moral rather than an ethical claim on it via a logic of anti-Blackness. The anti-Blackness in part shapes the lives of Afro-Palestinians does not mean that this recognition subtends a call to end settler colonialism. In fact, it should heighten that call with a potential desire for a kind of Black liberatory project still not yet witnessed globally. I turn to this example because it animates where I seek to turn now. Solidarity is really difficult political work. I think we all know this, but it's also necessary planetary work, the kind of work we can't shrink from if the planet is to be saved. if freedom or something approaching it is to be had. The recent US election that gave us the Biden-Harris administration is a case in point. This election left me in a deep political despair and frankly deeply suspicious of US progressives and the US left. In many ways, the desire to see Trump as the singular thing to be rid of left many of us living outside the center of empire shaking our heads. There are all kinds of ways to say wait, and US progressives and the left enacted one way, the lesser evil one. There are many ways to say Palestine can wait too. In the US, leading Black, POC, and white intellectuals articulated the last vote as the lesser evil vote. And yet we hold on to our solidarities with radical comrades there. We hold on to a shared commitment to a different kind of world. We need their voices, but we also now need other words out of their mouths, other tactics. We need to know what are they actually willing to risk. We want empire brought to its knees, and it has to begin at home. And it's poignantly clear that it can't begin with a lesser evil vote of politics. To disagree with the lesser evil voter is a way of saying to the rest of us, to agree with the lesser evil voter is a way of saying to the rest of us, simply wait. And to articulate this disagreement of tactics, to even want something more and something different, is not to diminish the important work of these figures, past or present, who I haven't named, but it's to insist on something else at this moment. It is to ask for all of us to risk something more. It is to state clearly what we can no longer live with, and it is to ask, will you join us now in something bigger than refusal? Will you break the national barrier and boundary in service of a different kind of global? It is to insist on a more robust engagement with what tactics might be necessary for our now. This agreement is useful for moving our political actions in important ways. It is important for clarifying risks and for verifying commitments, as well as for opening new arenas of political action. In my teenage years and early 20s, I would hide South African produce like many others in the supermarket, or load it up and then cancel the order at the cash register. For years after formal apartheid ended, I was convinced that South African wine tasted terrible, because I was raised that as long as apartheid existed in South Africa, nothing sanctioned by that state could be of any use. I offer these as examples of how South Africa was made a pariah state. We follow and we take guidance from Palestinian BDS. I ask with all political sincerity, is it not time for escalation? It is clear to me that in Canada and the US, we are now tasked with taking more risks than we have done so far. I always reach for Fanon, who reminds us that nationalism is only so useful as it might produce an international dimension that concerns itself with the freedom of the outcasts. This international dimension that Fanon points us to might well be called solidarity. The political and ethical demand that solidarity with Palestine demands of us stretches our practice of solidarity towards something like an international commons. And so it should be. We are at a new political conjuncture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronaldo. Thanks so much. And now I'm going to turn to Professor Himani Banerjee.
You're muted.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are. We can hear you.
Okay, I just wanted to thank you all for letting me join with you in this call or plea for justice, for struggle, and for memory of the past that we all must remember to go forward. And looking at the map on Israel, I was reminded, it always makes me think of a dagger. It's like a dagger plunged into the heart of Palestine. And to see the little vanishing bits, the green becoming tiny vanishing bits, is this complete swallowing up of this space, the people, and all that it means in this huge imperialist project. And it really mirrors all the imperialist, colonial, racialized projects that have happened in the world in all of last century. The question of Palestine has been with us from the early 20th century. So by now, one would have thought that this dagger would not have been allowed to plunge so deeply into the heart of Palestine. And I also want to say that solidarity means a lot to me. Allyship is also, but it also is to stay a little bit outsider, a little bit a bystander, and being a solidaritist with somebody else. But the fact is that Israel holds up a mirror to all of us, to the deepest core of our own sense of personal justice towards ourselves and everybody else. I mean, forget all politics. At the basic human level, this question and this situation has remained like indescribably painful. And in fact, words are meaningless when it comes to talking about it. However, people have shown not only solidarity, but an ability to change places, and this did not happen now, even in 1982, when Israel attacked the Palestinian camps in Shatila and Sabra. June Jordan wrote a fantastic poem with which I will end. I'll read it now. And I should begin by saying that the poem comes from a collection called Living Room. And I want to talk about a little bit about the irony of that title, because living room was the expression that the Nazis used, on which she puts another twist, which with the word Lebensraum. Germans needed more living room. So the attacks on country after country happened in Europe in the name of Lebensraum. And she turns that meaning, June Jordan, upside down on its head to talk about another kind of life, another living room. So here it's not just a question of solidarity, it's a question of exposure of the deepest connectivity that exists between all of us. And here this cannot take any language, tolerate the language of appropriation, separate identities, specific, yes, but not separate, and how we must be one in this common struggle that all of you have so movingly, beautifully talked about. So I will just switch over to the voice of June Jordan, and I will think I am her as she was Palestinian. I do not wish to speak about the bulldozer and the red dirt, not quite covering all of the arms and legs, nor do I wish to speak about the night-long screams that reached the observation posts where soldiers lounged about. Nor do I want to speak about the woman who shoved her baby into the stranger's hands before she was led away. Nor do I wish to speak about the father whose sons were shot through the head, while they slit his own throat before the eyes of his wife. Nor do I wish to speak about the army that lit continuous flares into the darkness so that others could see the backs of their victims lined against the wall. Nor do I wish to speak about the piled up bodies and the stench that will not float. Nor do I wish to speak about the nurse again and again raped before they murdered her on the hospital floor. Nor do I wish to speak about the rattling bullets that didn't halt on that keening trajectory. Nor do I wish to speak about the pounding on the doors and the breaking of windows and the hauling of families into the world of the dead. I do not wish to speak about the bulldozer and the red dirt not quite covering the arms and the legs, because I do not wish to speak about unspeakable events that must follow from those who dare to purify a people, those who dare to exterminate a people. Those who dare to describe human beings as beasts with legs. Those who dare to mop up, to tighten the noose, to step up the military pressure, to ring around civilian streets with tanks. Those who dare to close the universities, to abolish the press, to kill the elected representatives of the people who refuse to be purified. Those are the ones from whom we must redeem the words of our beginning. Because I need to speak about home, I need to speak about living room, where the land is not bullied and beaten into a tombstone. I need to speak about the living room where the talk will take place in my language. I need to speak about living room, where my children will grow without horror. I need to speak about living room where the men of my family between the ages of 6 and 65 are not marched into a roundup that leads to the grave. I need to talk about the living room where I can sit without grief, without wailing aloud for my loved ones, where I must not ask, where is Abu Fatih? Because he will be there beside me. I need to talk about living room because I need to talk about home. I was born a black woman and now I'm become a Palestinian. Against the relentless laughter of evil, there is less and less living room. And where are my loved ones? It is time to make our way to the home. Thank you.
Thank you, Himani. Thank you so much. This was a very robust, engaging, amazing conversation. I mean, we expansive. You know, the vanishing of Palestinian territory, the vanishing of Palestine. You know, the ongoing occupation and ongoing annexation of Palestinian territories, as we heard. You know, we've heard about solidarity and a kind of positive hopefulness about the uprising and the ongoing struggles that we see of women in Palestine and women in prisons who refuse to back down in the face of the ongoing, Israeli oppression and ongoing Israeli genocide of Palestinian people. And we hear that, and we hear from Mark that we no longer can continue to maintain this situation, that it has to change, in totality, and that Israel will not, under any circumstances, surrender. And we know that it will never allow for Palestinian self-determination. And, Ronaldo talks about, and I thought that was really, really critical and really important for me to hear as someone who has also been an activist for a long time. I've known Nahla for 30 years in Palestinian and anti-apartheid struggle and those kinds of connections, right? And hearing you talk about, one of the things is, how South Africa became a pariah eventually for all its problems now, and how do we make Israel, or what can we do to ensure or to Israel to become a pariah as South Africa has become? And is that ever possible? And what it is to make this happen? And what kind of struggle is BDS and the work of BDS enough to actually shift things? Or is it, has it run its course, in other words, in the way that it's actually functioning? So I'm just going to, and I want to ask and I think it would be great to give you all an opportunity to talk to each other, because I felt there was so much said in this conversation. And I'm looking at your faces and I'm sensing that you may want to respond to each other, which is what this should be, an engagement, between you on the panel in terms of this conversation. So I want to open that up. We do have a couple of questions, but I felt certain the questions doesn't speak to some of what has happened here. And I'm wondering, and I'm wanting to hear you respond to each other. And then if we have time, we can go to some of the questions. And if that's something you want to do. Because I felt you all have said so much. There were some intersecting points, but there were some critical other edges that I feel could be explored and discussed.
Okay, may I start?
Yes, Nahla.
Okay. I want to start with my friend and my love, actually, Himani, and thank her for this so powerful poem that you read, Himani. I know that you yourself have written several poems about Palestine and Palestinians, and all of them have been, so powerful and from the inside. I've been having discussions with Himani for, I don't remember now, so many years, actually, more than 10, more than 20, more than 30, maybe, I don't know. It looks like since I was born, I have been, knowing Himani and visiting Himani and staying in her room, and incidentally, in her living room. Incidentally, in her living room, I completed my book, Captain Revolution, in her, because I was there doing my second transplant, or third, God knows by now, liver transplant. And, I stayed in her house, and, I produced one of, I think, my most, I'm very proud of that, piece that I produced in her house. So Himani's, usually Himani speaks from the heart. And this is why I love her so much. I mean, she tells you what she feels, and she is always, straightforward. I know I'm supposed to be talking academically here. I don't want to talk academically. Sorry about that. I want to talk personal. I want to talk solidarity in the deepest sense of it. And this is part of the deep sense that, I have towards many or most of my friends here. Chandni, I am, as usual, proud of you and proud of what you produce, and, your struggle for Palestine and the Palestinians is so genuine that I know you, despite, the attack that was against you, you continued. You're still standing on your feet, and you continue to work and, and produce wisdom. Thank you for this, Chandni. Ronaldo, what can I say? I love you. I loved your presentation. It is brilliant. Although at another time, I want me and you to get together and discuss colonial liberalism. I'm not sure I understand that, the notion, because what comes out of colonialism is only violence and destruction. I don't see even, a slight thing of the liberal in colonialism. It is devastating, and it is, visceral. Although some of us do not like this notion that I think Fanon has talked about, how colonialism sort of seeps into your internal organs and make you stand up on your feet and want to struggle and want to resist. Okay, and this is something that only people who are under colonialism or understand colonialism or in solidarity with anti-colonial movement can understand this kind of position. So thank you for your talk here. I'm missing someone here. I mean, I am following who I see. Oh, Mark. Hi, Mark. As usual, I've listened to you several times. I read you, and I am impressed with with your stand on the whole thing. And thank you so much for for the work you're doing. I know, Mark, you don't need to be thanked, and you're not asking for it because this is your job, as it is my job. This is your your duty, as it is my duty, and the duty of other friends and colleagues of ours. So I don't have, as I said, I don't have any intelligent sentence here or any academic word to anyone, but I have all the love to all of you guys. I'll stop here.
That was wonderful, Nahla. Thank you.
Oh, and to you too, by the way. I forgot to even thank you. See how obsessed I was with the presentation. I forgot to thank you. Guys, we need to also acknowledge that the call for this meeting came from Beverly and Minsuk Lee. It didn't come from me. So it came from them. They asked me, and we continued, and we worked on it. So many thank you. Many thanks, Beverly, and thank you, Minsuk Lee as well.
This is why Scholar Strike exists. It's for this kind of conversation. It's the extension beyond from the it's the university and the community. That extension, as I think Ronaldo mentioned, trying to bridge that, where those conversations can happen boldly. without any kind of interference. Yes, Ronaldo, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, can I say something?
Yeah.
I think first, Nahla, thank you for being so kind, and Himani, thank you for the reading, and my colleagues for your presentations and for this discussion that I think is really, really, really quite important. I know that Mark and I particularly addressed in university much more pointedly. I'm playing with this term colonial liberalism because I think that we are actually living in a really kind of interesting moment where post-48, these settler colonies remake themselves as liberal bastions of representative democracy, and continually unfolding from that through logics and discourses of multiculturalism, politics of recognition, and all this kind of stuff. They have, at each time that there's been significant pressure brought to bear on the potential transformation of the state, that they have incorporated others through these kind of liberal practices. And those liberal practices actually extend the much older, violent, extractive colonial project. But many of the people who we would normally imagine would be a part of the kind of resistance to ongoing colonization become wrapped up and caught up in colonialism's liberalism, in what I'm calling colonial liberalism. So that many people who should right now be as outraged as we are and wanting to take to the streets and wanting to take to our classrooms and overturn the absurdities of CBC radio, what's happening on our university campuses, the donors and so on, are now occupied with colonial liberalism through the logic of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Mm. They've come to believe that that is the route to transformation, without realizing that it actually holds in place the colonial project, both the old, violent, rapacious colonial project and the new colonial project, that is about financialization and secured borders and all of this other kind of stuff. So I'm playing with this term and I'm still trying to work it out. But I think there's something at stake in recognizing that some of the folks who would normally see as allies are really caught in that moment. And I think that Mark was speaking very much to that through the example that he gave of liberal colleagues talking students out of doing particular kinds of research, especially research in Palestine. When I first began teaching at York back in the mid-1990s, liberal colleagues were telling students that they shouldn't study Black Canada because if there was ever going to be a job, there would be one job. So only one student should do a dissertation on Black Canada, right? So you can take these kinds of logics really shape how we engage with each other and really put a wedge between the growing numbers of people who should be in the kind of deep solidarity and be a part of the movements that we're trying to articulate. So of course, I come across a little bit more pessimistic than Chandni in relationship to the question of how solidarities and identifications, especially in this moment of the most recent war in Palestine. And yes, there were those movements that happened at various ports around the world in Canada and the US and elsewhere. But at the same time, there's the there's BLM post-Ferguson 2014, and there's BLM and the amazing campaign document that they put out, I think was in 2016. And now there's the BLM that seems to be wrapped up and caught up in the US Democratic Party. So we've set from 2014 to 2021, we've got 3 stages of the movement for Black Lives and in particular the organization BLM that we're going to have to kind of figure out and reckon with because of the way in which much of it seems not to be wrapped up in the US democratic machinery. And it's from that basis that I think we need to open a conversation about tactics, about new strategies, and what it means to do that kind of deep solidarity work inside the geographies that we're in, that I think call for something more than mitigating harm through lesser evil, voter politics.
Yeah.
That the kind of, for me, one of the questions becomes, when will leading US intellectuals, many of whom I deeply admire, for instance, I'm going to be as vulgar in this sense, when will they ask the people of the US to take to the streets and bring empire to the knees, as we have seen happen in other countries, that they support, that they call for, that they celebrate? What I keep seeing is a politics of attenuation, which seems to say to me that if you're in the geography of the US, your life is more valuable than if you're somewhere else and willing to stand up against the troops and the armies and the armaments in that other geography. And I'm trying to work all of that out. So that's part of what I was trying to say.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Ronaldo. Mark?
Thank you very much.
I'm so glad this is happening. This is great.
Well, thank you, and Beverly, as Nahla said, you're the reason why this is all happening. You and Minsuk, so thank you.
Well, Minsuk and I, yeah.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So thank you all. I enjoyed all of the presentations, of course, and I will admit pretty much everything that I know about how the university works, I've learned from Ronaldo's tweets. I would suggest to people that want to learn how the university works, don't read academic plans and strategic plans, and don't waste your time with that nonsense. A couple of 40-character tweets from Ronaldo will tell you way more about the logic of the university and how it works. So a couple of things that sort of stood out to me as well in the discussion, and I want to finish with BDS. So I just want to go back to the question of apartheid and settler colonialism and how they conceptually relate. And Ronaldo touched on that as well, and Chandni, and of course Nahla in their discussions. To me, and this is really exemplified in Mahmoud Mamdani's book, Neither Settler Nor Native, and especially in the case of Palestine. Apartheid is not the end game. Apartheid is the holding position. Apartheid is a form of power that seeks to cement the settler colonial victory, the settler colonial conquest. settler colonial domination. So, and it works across all of historic Palestine, as Nahla very importantly pointed out. So there's a apartheid power being enacted against the Palestinian citizens of Israel. There's apartheid power against the Palestinians of East Jerusalem. There's apartheid power against the, and it will operate a little bit differently in all those spaces, but nonetheless, overall, its overall strategic purpose is to cement settler colonial conquest and expand it. So the expansion of settler colonial conquest in Sheikh Jarrah is through apartheid laws. Right, there's laws that will only apply to the Palestinians, through which they lose their homes in Israeli courts of law, not Israeli courts of justice. There is no such thing. So it's really important to situate apartheid within that larger settler colonial system of domination. I don't view it as a separate, I don't view it as a form of power that supplants settler colonial power. It is that which works within it in order to cement it and expand it. So I find that useful for people who struggle within those terms and how do they conceptualize them. In terms of BDS and actions and where do we go from here? So BDS is an excellent entry point for people who are new to this. I encourage everyone to familiarize themselves with BDS. Go to their website, read Marwan Barghouti's book. Marwan, I always mix the Barghouti. Omar. Sorry, Omar. Sorry, Omar. I've met Omar a couple of times, but Omar Barghouti's book. So, if that's a good way for you to start and engage with that. Now, BDS has made some achievements. It has faced serious limitations. It doesn't operate in the same context as South African boycotts did. There are, scholars have written a lot about this, and it's important to acknowledge that. But right now, it is what exists as a structure anyway that is out there. People know it at least. There are some actions that are successful within it, so it's a good way to start. But ultimately, I do think, and I've been thinking more about this over the last year. So I'm not to follow Nahla's lead. I'm not talking about this in a super academic way, but as a sort of a beginning of an academic way of thinking about this as well. The Bolivian struggle to me offers a much more hopeful and fruitful and closer, even perhaps, mode of struggle. Now that also involved boycotts, and none of it won't as well work the same way as it did in Palestine, right? Like, so the indigenous, as far as I have learned so far, and I have more to learn about it, but the indigenous struggle in Bolivia involved massive economic disruption. I mean, they brought the economy to a halt. That's how they brought the empire, their empire, to its knees. They didn't bring the American empire to its knees. They brought at least the Bolivian imperial puppets of the empire to its knees and replace it with an indigenous government. And guess what? Bolivia is the most, the most pro-Palestinian government in the world, probably. More so than, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm liking my Ireland right now, but Bolivia is maybe a little bit ahead. But I do think we need to start talking, I think, more tactically and strategically about a sort of a global resistance to empire. I don't want to just boycott Israel. I want to boycott the US too. How do we get the world off of American money, off of American power? That's very harmful. That's very destructive across the entire globe. So I've been struggling with this as well lately. Is how do we talk about solidarity across these global spaces around a shared vision, and I think we discussed this a few years back at a symposium that Ronaldo was at as well. And it's a difficult, it's not an easy thing to come up with a shared vision across that many varied experiences of power and domination. But yet it seems to me necessary because the states, not just the United States, but states, they coordinate with each other. They have embassies, they have G7s and G8s and G20s and whoever other G meetings. They have constant, open lines of communication. They share technology. They have trade policies, et cetera, et cetera. It's a massive structure of coordination that states have with each other. That's why it's not a shock, really, when you see that Australia and Canada are taking the exact same positions, using the exact same headlines on Palestine. They talk to each other. That's how. They copy each other. They go, okay, well, how do we help our settler colonial allies and imperial masters, and they do it. Imperial masters in the U.S. So how do we combat that? How do we resist that together in solidarity? Is a really tricky question, but one that I think needs to be tackled head on. And addressed head on in both academic terms and in practical terms as well. And I also just maybe if I have one more minute, Himani, that was an absolutely lovely poem, and I hate to do this because I need to read and sit with the poem for a while, and this is my first introduction to it before I make a comment on it. But I'll try anyway, and you'll tell me if I'm way off. But one of the things that sort of appealed to me in it was this, the poem speaks to the in sort of the unrepresentable pain of suffering and death as the source of our, as the source and vitality of our efforts to build a new world. In a sense, we're trying to build on a futurity. I don't know how to say that word. That has been, violently taken away from the dead, and trying to reimagine our new world in a way that respects that respects the unspeakability of the pain and suffering and the death. And I just find that incredibly inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Himani?
Go on or no?
You want to speak?
I want to speak.
Yes.
Just wanted to say one thing is that, there's no skirting around. June Jordan poem teaches us that we cannot walk around the disaster, but we must walk through it. If you are going to, nothing is pleasant. The word pleasantry is obscenity under the circumstances.
Yes.
So you have to see the blood, the gore, the dead and the dying. But the dead are not dead really. They are erupting as the force from which her poetry is generating. And she's not making a distinction between being of her, this or that, but the becoming of her into another person. And I think we all have a birth and beginning for which is random. We don't know where we appeared, we know why we appeared, sexual acts, and we came, but we don't know where we were going to go, what to do, or whatever. So the rest of it is ours, though. Where we were born is not our choice. But the rest of it, how we grew up, who we ally with, who we work with, that is up to us to do. So becoming is a very powerful part of identity. It's not found on the ground. It's what we make ourselves. Most of us were probably not meant to be the people we have become within the social normalcy of where we were born. And we have yet become in spite of everything. So if this is not our identity and it's not overlapping, then what is people's identity? It's an unrolling thing. It's an identifying act. Who do I identify with is also the identity. And going back to Ronaldo, and I completely agree with everybody that I would really frankly say burn it all down. We need to clean up. That's and that's the sentence. When I see Israel as a dagger, and when I think that Lebensraum of the Nazis is the Lebensraum of Israel and its settler colonial project, all settler colonial projects are Lebensraum project. Hitler wasn't unusual in that. So all that is true, but the trouble is that whereas the governments get in touch with each other through their linear linkages, we are far apart from each other.
Yeah.
That is, things happening in Guatemala, in Nicaragua, in Bolivia, the Peruvian election, all stuff in Modi's India and everything. We have to really connect at the lower level rather than the top level. And that's easier too, because the lower level people want to be known by each other. They'd like you to know them. People I know in Calcutta would like you to know them. I grew up in a country where PLO had an office, and with an Indian passport, you couldn't go to Israel and come back to India because Israel was not included in Indian passport. But has it really changed in the end? Is Modi's India not too very close to Israel, sitting on its lap? But common people carry on a kind of a tradition of refusal, and I think would really like to connect with people. And as for the university, it was something we fought for, education. It wasn't just their gift. And I think it's a two-sided gift in the sense that, the one side is to dominate and hegemonize, but the other side is they were forced to yield these spaces because people fought for them. When I came to Canada in 1969, there was no Black studies, even African American studies, Canadian studies, women's studies, African studies, Latin American studies, all of this. Now it looks like business as usual, and they've become a way of upward mobility, right? And why will they not? I don't think it's even conscious, but an institution expands at its own need. And we who become part of it have to bend it to suit ours. So the institution, the university, is a site of struggle. I think everyone has meant that because we're there, right? If we were on the street, it wouldn't have been any easier. Anywhere else wouldn't have been, and we have to be somewhere because we're embodied beings and we need a wage or some money to be alive and join the market. So under these circumstances, the university, like all reality, is a matter of pull and push. We wanted anti-racism, they gave us multiculturalism.
Yeah.
You want feminism, they gave you femocracy and a few, glass ceiling breakers. I mean, this is the thing that this struggle is real. We are in class. We are in a class struggle. And they too are a class. Just because ordinary people are identified as classes in class struggle, the bourgeoisie are a class. The state is its servant, essentially, and joined together at the hip. So we have to, and I think that people like you should be where you are. Every year, more people go through your hands than of any political worker in this country. If you change even 10 people's way of thinking every year, 10 people will teach 10 more people each. This is political work.
Mm-hmm.
And you've been doing it all this time. So in spite of the refinement of colonial liberalism or neo-colonial liberalism, the fact is everywhere there is an entry, get into it and be a wedge. go in as a thin thing and begin to widen it up. I mean, enforce the contradictions. Otherwise, no other way. Where will you go?
Mm.
You know, could become guerrillas in Northern Ontario, but won't be too long. So,
Oh, thank you so much, Himani. We're at 6 o'clock. Yes, Chandni, I'll give you the last word. And then, because we are at 6 o'clock, but this is so great. This is such an amazing, amazing conversation. Thank you. Thank you all. I'm so overcome. Yes, Chandni, sorry.
Oh, so as I guess, Himani, as you bring up this notion of becoming and not being born in a place, but then, you know, also becoming, for me, all three of you, Nahla, Himani, Ronaldo, all three of you are my teachers, you know, and have been central in my becoming as well, at least theoretically. So I want to just highlight and honor that in terms of becoming, I think of that both personally and then politically. It also reminds me of Sumud, like Nahla was trying to really articulate what Sumud is, and it is about that political becoming, is that in the actual act of it, you become whatever it is you become. Going to Ronaldo's point around, you know, the piece on pessimism and solidarity and hope, I'm actually a lot more pessimistic than I reveal publicly. And part of that is because we straddle the line of trying to mobilize and bring people into a struggle, and then actually having these like private conversations of all of the pessimism, sometimes actually public, but you know, so I think part of it is articulating, like, absolutely, in terms of when I think about the three sort of moments you described around BLM and seeing this kind of shift towards voter politics, this is a very neoliberal, or how you've kind of articulated what colonial liberalism precisely is, in that is not it, you know. This is not the reactionary tactics is not what we want. The reactionary change is not what you want by engaging the NDP or the Liberal Party or whatever. The party politics are going to uphold empire or Canadian imperialism or the settler state itself. That's not how liberation comes. And I think when that's the strategy people take, whether that's strategic or not, I don't know. I'm very skeptical about that kind of stuff. And I think in the university, EDI is very dangerous, you know, very, very dangerous. I think that we can say that, oh, equity and diversity inclusion stuff can be an opening, and perhaps it is, but I also think that the university creates those offices for those people to fail. And so there's something about the EDI responses around academic work that I don't necessarily think is helpful, but I guess some people think it's a good opening and entry place for engaging politics of shift or change in the university. But also speaking about BDS, you know, going to the criticisms of BDS, yes, like I am an advocate for it. I've been organizing around BDS for over a decade, but I think that there's also a liberal element to BDS, right? In terms of how the human rights framework or the international law framework that BDS operates from. And I think that though the kind of language of settler colonialism, military occupation, and apartheid are adopted and strategically used as a way to also build in the mainstream, I think part of it is an external strategy in the post-Oslo moment as a way to reconsolidate people, because there are internal fractures in terms of leadership within the Palestinian struggle. So in the absence of a revolution, BDS either becomes a time sort of holder, a placeholder to build something that will be far more radical, or when there's a new intifada and that has demands for what the new strategies and tactics looks like globally, maybe that will be then the moment or the period that we enter. And I think, so again, on the one hand, it's these contradictions that I feel like I'm constantly struggling with, where we understand the liberal elements of it, or we understand, and then we also understand the strategic use of it at particular moments. I also think when folks, especially in North America, are trying to understand colonialism, what I know, like something I am up against a lot is also realizing that the ways in which Canada gets conflated with Israel is really problematic in terms of understanding settler colonialism, or the US, because these have distinct histories and distinct histories and formations, state formations. And so something I've been trying to intervene on is to actually also, for folks to understand, students, scholars, activists, all sorts of people, to also try to understand the specificities of these places, where they overlap, where they differ, and then where there are points of openings where you can actually, world make. And I think that's where I want to sort of bring like my remarks to an end in terms of, I'm so interested, Ronaldo, in the question you ask around the escalation of the international commons. I think there's something really important around this, because if we work outside of the nation state model, right, and this world making model where all of us are trying to build something that is radically new, and you escalate strategies for this international commons, we can't even do the kinds of basic things we're doing right now that are the strategies and tactics at our disposal. And so I suppose that I want to leave this thought for all of us, is that I suppose if we want to escalate our strategies and tactics for both in the university and outside, then perhaps it's in the living room that we need to all meet in behind closed doors to have this conversation so we can escalate our struggle. Thank you.
Yeah. And I mean, I just need to say, as Himani was talking, and as you just ended, Chandni, it reminds me of what we did, in the 70s and the 80s, when we had international socialist and communist struggles. I mean, I grew up. I sort of when I was in my 20s and I was in the communist and socialist movements. There was a lot of international struggle. I was in solidarity with Latin America, with Africa, with Palestine, with the Caribbean. There were multiple relational and international struggles happening at the same time. And you had people who you were connected with and who carried and who provided you, with various kinds of support, and provided these movements with all kind of clandestine supports, right? Remember, Nicaragua, Cuba, where all these clandestine support, Grenada, which I was also in Grenada, that kind of struggle happened on the ground. But as Himani was saying, I think we no longer have that kind of network, or that kind of global kind of connection. So we have to do it in a different way, but in terms of sort of much more contained kind of organizing in particular areas, in particular spaces. But it's very hard now to do this sort of broad-based organizing, or to get people to really, engage, because of the nature of where we are at, right? So we've come to the end of our evening. We can go on forever, because I just need to tell people that we've gotten amazing comments in the chat. Just people just saying, this is amazing, this is amazing, this is amazing, this is so wonderful. We haven't gotten any negative. Nobody came out and knock us or say, why are you talking about Palestine? All we've gotten is, really, we wish this could go on forever. We wish this could go on longer. We wish this could continue, that it was an amazing and necessary conversation. And it was an amazing and necessary conversation. And I want to thank you all for allowing us, Minster Kanai and Scholars Strike, to do this with you all. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And have a good evening, all of you.
You too.
Lovely to see you all.
Yeah,
lovely to see you guys.
Solidarity and struggle.
Yes.
Solidarity and